Anaya did not know that the most dangerous man in the city was looking for her. She was not aware that for 3 months, his people had been quietly searching, following faint trails, all leading to this gilded ballroom where she felt more like a ghost than a guest. She had no idea that her name, whispered once in a moment of kindness to a stranger, had become an obsession for a man who took what he wanted and destroyed what stood in his way. All Anaya knew was the familiar, crushing weight of her own invisibility, a cloak woven for her by the very people who should have helped her shine. The fabric of her emerald green dress, a soft, whispering silk she'd found in a vintage store, felt like armor, but it was failing. It couldn't protect her from the coldness in her mother's eyes or the dismissive wave of her father's hand. And it certainly couldn't protect her from her sister. The memory of last Tuesday was still a fresh wound, stinging beneath the surface of her carefully applied composure. She'd been sitting in a small cafe, nursing a lukewarm latte and sketching in her notebook, when a shadow fell over her table. It was Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, his smile as thin and cheap as the suit he wore. "Well, look at you," he'd said, his eyes raking over her body with casual cruelty. "Still hiding behind baggy clothes, I see. Put on a little weight, since I did you the favor of leaving." The words had landed like stones, and she'd felt the familiar, hot shame creep up her neck. He was a ghost from a past she'd tried to bury, a past where she had tried to shrink herself to fit into his narrow expectations and failed. His mockery was just another voice in a chorus that had been singing the same song her entire life. Not good enough, not thin enough, not enough. She'd simply closed her notebook, paid her bill, and walked out without a word, his laughter following her into the street. Now, standing at the edge of the ballroom, that laughter echoed in her mind, blending with the tinkling of champagne flutes and the brittle chatter of the city's elite. She was a stray thought in a room of declarations, a muted color in a world of blinding vibrancy. Her sister, Alani, glided through the crowd like a panther, draped in a gown the color of spilled wine. Every eye was on her, and she drank the attention like air. Her husband, a billionaire with a face like a clenched fist, was a perfect accessory to her ambition. When Alani's gaze finally landed on Anaya, it was sharp and disappointed. She drifted over, her smile a predatory curve. "Still lurking in the corners, little sister?" Alani's voice was a silken thread of poison. "You should try to mingle." Though I can't imagine with whom, Anaya clutched her small handbag, the worn leather a small comfort against her palm. "I'm fine right here." "You're never fine," Alani scoffed, adjusting the diamond collar at her throat. It glittered like a beautiful cage. "Look at you. In that dress. You look like a child playing dress-up in her mother's curtains." The words were designed to strip her bare, to remind her of her place. Anaya's spine stiffened. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of her. Alani leaned closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Honestly, Anaya, why do you even come to these things? It's embarrassing for me." "Nobody wants you here," she laughed then, a light, tinkling sound that was uglier than any scream. "Nobody wants you. Period." The word struck home, a final, perfect blow that shattered the last of Anaya's fragile armor. She felt the eyes of those nearby flicker towards them, their curiosity piqued by the little drama. Alani turned away, dismissing her completely, leaving Anaya to drown in the silence she left behind. The pain was so acute it was almost physical, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Alani was right. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong anywhere. She turned to flee, to find a dark corner or an unlocked door to the kitchens, anywhere she could disappear. But as she turned, she felt it. A change in the atmosphere. A sudden, profound stillness in the chaotic energy of the room. It was a gaze. Heavy, intense, and utterly unblinking. It was coming from across the room, and it was aimed directly at her. From the far side of the ballroom, framed by an archway draped in shadow, he watched her. Anaya had never seen a man command a space with such absolute stillness. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, tailored to perfection over a frame that spoke of disciplined power. broad shoulders, a lean waist, and a height that set him above nearly everyone else in the room. His black hair was impeccably styled, but it was his face that held her captive. It was a masterpiece of sharp angles and unforgiving lines, handsome in a way that was more dangerous than beautiful. And his eyes. Even from this distance, she could see they were pale, a startling, glacial gray that stood in stark contrast to his dark features. They were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity, a predator's focus that saw nothing else in the crowded space. The air around him seemed to crackle with a silent, potent energy. People gave him a wide berth, their conversations faltering as they passed, their gazes skittering away as if direct eye contact might be fatal. He was a storm cloud in a room full of sunshine, and the storm was looking right at her. Anaya's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her first instinct was panic. She must have done something wrong. Was she standing in a reserved spot? Had she inadvertently offended someone important? But his expression wasn't angry. It was something else entirely. It was recognition, a deep, resonant certainty that vibrated across the expanse of marble floor between them. She felt a tremor run through her, a strange mix of terror and a bizarre, inexplicable pull. It was as if a string, invisible and taut, had been tied from his chest to hers, and he was slowly, deliberately, beginning to reel it in. Her sister's cruel words, "Nobody wants you," echoed in her ears, a bitter, ironic counterpoint to the man's unwavering stare. It made no sense. Men like him didn't look at women like her. They looked at women like Alani, polished, perfect, and ruthless. Anaya was a half-finished sketch, a forgotten melody. Then he moved. It was not a sudden motion, but a fluid, deliberate uncoiling from the shadows. He pushed away from the archway, and with that single action, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. A ripple of awareness spread from him like a shockwave. Whispers erupted, heads turned. The ambient chatter of the party dipped, replaced by a tense, curious hum. He ignored it all. His pale eyes never left hers as he began to cross the room. He didn't hurry, yet his every step was imbued with an unstoppable purpose. The crowd, a sea of glittering jewels and tailored suits, parted before him as if by an unspoken command. People melted out of his path, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. Anaya was frozen in place, her feet seemingly rooted to the floor. Flight was impossible. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to become the invisible girl her sister believed her to be, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only watch as the distance between them shrank. 10 yards. 5. He was closer now, and the details of his face sharpened. A faint, white scar cut through one of his dark eyebrows, a relic of a life she couldn't begin to imagine. His mouth was a firm, unsmiling line, yet there was no cruelty in it. Only resolve. Alani, who had been preening for a small audience, noticed the shift in the room. Her smile faltered as she followed the collective gaze of her admirers. Her eyes widened when she saw who was approaching, and then narrowed in utter disbelief when she realized his destination. It was Anaya, the most powerful man in the room, the enigmatic and feared Jaehoon, leader of the Golden Coil Syndicate, was walking directly toward her insignificant little sister. For a moment, Alani's perfect mask of superiority cracked, revealing the raw, ugly confusion beneath. It was impossible. It was a mistake. He had to be looking for someone else, someone standing behind Anaya. But there was no one there. There was only Anaya, standing alone in her simple green dress, the unwitting focal point of a silent, unfolding drama that had captured the entire ballroom. He stopped a mere foot in front of her. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, the space between them charged with a humming, electric current. Up close, he was overwhelming. The sheer force of his presence was a physical thing, a pressure against her skin. He smelled of expensive cologne, something clean and sharp like winter air, with an underlying hint of leather and something metallic like steel. Anaya had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and the proximity stole the breath from her lungs. His pale gray eyes, flecked with silver, were even more intense now, scanning her face as if committing every detail to memory. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, not pity, not lust, but something that looked like relief. As if he'd been on a long journey and had finally reached his destination. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Anaya's mind was a blank slate, all her fears and insecurities wiped away by the sheer, stunning improbability of the moment. She felt a bead of nervous sweat trickle down her back. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, a deep rumble that vibrated right through her. It was quiet, meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. "You are Anaya," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of discovery. She could only manage a small, jerky nod, her throat too tight for words. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his lips, a subtle shift that transformed his severe face into something devastatingly handsome. "I am Jae-hwan," he continued. "I have been looking for you," her mind reeled. Looking for me? The idea was so absurd, so fantastical, it felt like a line from a dream she couldn't place. Why? The word was a choked whisper, the only thing she could force out. His gaze softened, a hint of unexpected tenderness in his formidable expression. "The woman who works at the front desk of the free clinic," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "My grandmother was ill. You stayed past your shift to make sure she was comfortable. You brought her a blanket and a cup of tea. You told her stories about your own grandmother." The memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp and clear. An elderly Korean woman, frail and frightened, who spoke little English. Anaya had simply seen someone in need and acted, a small, instinctual kindness she'd forgotten almost immediately. She hadn't known who she was. "She told me about the girl with kind eyes and a soul the color of a spring forest," Jae-hwan murmured, his gaze dropping to her green dress and then returning to her face. "She said you were a rare thing." She was right. "Well, isn't this interesting?" Alani's voice sliced through the intimate bubble that had formed around them. She had materialized at Anaya's side, her husband trailing behind her like a well-fed bulldog. Her smile was brittle, stretched tight across her face in a desperate attempt to reclaim control of the situation. "Mr. Kong," she said, her tone dripping with false familiarity. "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to my family. This is my little sister, Anaya." She's a bit shy. She placed a proprietary hand on Anaya's shoulder, the grip just a little too tight, a silent warning. "I'm sure she's terribly flattered by the attention, but she's not really accustomed to this sort of environment." The dismissal was clear. "She's not one of us. She's not worthy of your time." Jae-hwan's gaze shifted to Alani. The warmth that had been in his eyes when he looked at Anaya vanished, replaced by a chilling emptiness. The temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I am not speaking with you," he said, the words as sharp and cold as chips of ice. Alani flinched as if struck. A flush of angry color rose in her cheeks. Her husband puffed out his chest, stepping forward slightly. "Now see here." Jae-hwan's eyes flicked to him, and the man froze, his bravado deflating like a pricked balloon. Whatever he saw in that pale, flat stare made him take a half-step back, his mouth snapping shut. Jae-hwan's attention returned to Anaya, his expression softening once more. He completely ignored her sister as if she had ceased to exist. He extended a hand to Anaya, his palm open. It was a large hand, with long, elegant fingers and callous knuckles that spoke of a life far removed from this glittering ballroom. "Anaya," he said, his voice a low, commanding murmur that cut through Alani's sputtering indignation. "Will you allow me to escort you somewhere more pleasant?" It was an offer, a choice, but it felt like a decree of fate. This was her moment. She could shrink back under Alani's grip, back into the shadows, or she could take his hand. She looked from his waiting hand to her sister's furious face, and for the first time in her life, she felt a spark of defiance. She shrugged off Alani's hand. Then, slowly, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His skin was warm and firm. As his fingers closed around hers, a jolt of energy, pure and potent, shot up her arm. He drew her forward, tucking her hand into the crook of his elbow and settling her against his side. The solid wall of his body was a fortress. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the stunned onlookers and a seething Alani, before he began to lead Anaya away. It was a silent, public claiming, more powerful than any shouted declaration. He was taking her, and no one in that room dared to stand in his way. He led her not back into the throng, but through a set of tall glass doors that opened onto a secluded stone terrace. The cool night air was a balm on Anaya's heated skin. Below them, the city glittered like a carpet of fallen stars, and the noise of the party faded to a distant, muffled hum. The terrace was lit by the soft glow of lanterns, which cast long, dancing shadows across the flagstones. A gentle breeze stirred the silk of her dress around her ankles. Jaehoon didn't release her until they reached the far railing. He let go of her hand, but he remained close, turning to lean back against the stone, his powerful frame creating a barrier between her and the world. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the quiet more comforting than awkward. Anaya gripped the cool railing, her knuckles white, trying to process the dizzying sequence of events. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, stripped of the icy authority he'd used on her sister. She looked at him, truly looked at him, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. The hard lines of his face seemed to ease in the gentle light. The scar above his eye was more pronounced, a pale silver mark against his skin. I don't know what I am," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand." "Your grandmother, that was months ago. Some things are worth waiting for," he replied simply. His gaze was steady, patient. "My grandmother has a gift. She sees the truth of people, the threads that connect them. She said a thread that started with her led to you, and that your thread was woven from gold." Anaya shook her head, a small, disbelieving smile touching her lips. "I think your grandmother is mistaken. My thread is plain, gray cotton, and it's mostly frayed." The words were out before she could stop them. A raw piece of her insecurity laid bare. Jaehoon pushed off the railing and took a step closer. He was so near now she could see the intricate pattern of the silk in his tie, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but to gently move a stray curl that had fallen across her cheek, his fingers barely brushing her skin. The fleeting contact sent a shiver through her entire body. "She is never mistaken," he said, his voice a low, intense murmur. "They have taught you to see yourself in a warped mirror. They want you to believe you are plain so their own colors seem brighter." His eyes held hers, and in their pale depths, she saw an unwavering conviction that left her breathless. "I see you, Anaya. I see the strength you mistake for plainness. I see the fire you try so hard to hide. I see the gold." His words wrapped around her heart, squeezing gently. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her and seen more. They saw the quiet girl, the plain sister, the charity case. They saw what they wanted to see, a reflection of their own prejudices. But this man, this dangerous, powerful stranger, saw something else entirely. He saw a truth about herself that she'd never dared to believe in. "Why?" she asked again, the word full of a desperate need to understand. "Why go to all this trouble for a stranger who gave your grandmother a cup of tea?" "It was not just tea," he corrected softly. "It was kindness. In a world where kindness is a commodity, you gave it freely, with no expectation of reward. That is rarer than any diamond in that ballroom. And it is not a weakness. It is a form of power they will never understand." He watched her, his expression unreadable but for the intensity in his eyes. "My world is complicated. It is filled with shadows and sharp edges. Honesty is a weapon, and loyalty is a shield. I have been searching for something true. Something that is not a performance or a transaction." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "My grandmother saw it in you. And now so do I." Tears pricked at the back of Anaya's eyes, hot and sudden. She fought them back fiercely. Crying felt like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. But one traitorous tear escaped, tracing a silent path down her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, Jaehwan's thumb was there, his touch impossibly gentle against her skin. The pad of his thumb was slightly rough, a callous texture that spoke of a life of action, not leisure. The contrast between his formidable reputation and this tender, careful gesture was enough to shatter her remaining composure. The sob she'd been holding back escaped, a quiet, broken sound. She expected him to pull away, to be repulsed by her show of emotion. Instead, he simply held his hand there, his thumb stroking her cheek until the tear was gone. "There is no shame in the wounds they have given you," he murmured, his voice a comforting anchor in her emotional storm. The shame is all theirs. In that moment, something inside her shifted. A wall she had spent years building, brick by painful brick, began to crumble. She was so tired of being strong, of being resilient, of enduring. For the first time, she felt seen. And in being seen, she felt the first, fragile possibility of being safe. Tell us what you think Jaehwan should do to Anaya's sister in the comments. 3 months later, Anaya woke to the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft morning light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. She was not in her cramped childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and view of a brick wall. She was in Jaehwan's penthouse apartment, a serene space of clean lines, dark wood, and breathtaking views of the city skyline. She stretched, the luxurious silk sheets cool against her skin. The green dress from the ball hung in a garment bag in her expansive walk-in closet, a relic from a life that felt a lifetime away. She was no longer that girl, the one who flinched from shadows and lived on the scraps of affection her family deigned to throw her way. That girl was a ghost, a memory. The woman she was now smiled as she heard the soft clink of ceramic in the kitchen. She slipped out of bed, pulling on one of Jaehwan's soft, black cashmere sweaters. It fell to her mid-thigh, enveloping her in a scent. She padded barefoot across the cool marble floor into the open-plan living area. He was standing at the kitchen island, his back to her, dressed in simple gray sweatpants and a t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. He was focused on pouring 2 cups of coffee, his movements precise and economical. The morning sun caught the silver in his dark hair, and the fearsome leader of the Golden Coil Syndicate looked domestic, peaceful. The sight made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love she had known she was capable of feeling. He must have sensed her presence, because he turned, a small, private smile on his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. He held out a mug to her. "I thought you might be awake. You always think that," she teased, taking the warm mug. Her fingers brushed against his, and the familiar spark danced between them. "How do you do it?" "I listen for the sound of your heart starting its day," he answered, his expression completely serious. The simple, poetic declaration sent a warm flush through her. With him, romance wasn't in grand gestures, but in these quiet, intimate moments. It was in the way he always made sure the pantry was stocked with her favorite tea, the way he'd had a section of his vast library filled with art history books just for her, the way he would trace the lines of her palm when he thought she was asleep. He had shown her a world she never knew existed, not of crime and violence, but of unwavering devotion, fierce protection, and absolute acceptance. He had given her a home not made of walls and furniture, but of his steadfast presence. She was safe. She was cherished. She was loved. The past still lingered, but it no longer had the power to wound her. 2 weeks after the ball, a check had arrived from her father, a significant sum with a curtly written note that it was her final disbursement from the family. It was a severing of ties, a transactional dismissal. The Anaya of the past would have been devastated. The Anaya who was learning her own worth simply signed the check over to the free clinic where Jaehwan's grandmother had been treated. She never heard from her parents again. Alani was a different story. The society pages had been merciless after the ball. The story of the enigmatic Jaehwan publicly shunning the billionaire's wife for her mousy younger sister had become the stuff of legend. Alani's carefully curated world had imploded. Her husband, whose fortune was built on precarious alliances, had suffered. Reputations had been damaged. Anaya knew, through the quiet channels of Jae-hwan's organization, that Alani's marriage was crumbling, her social standing in tatters. A part of her felt a grim satisfaction, but it was a shallow, fleeting feeling. Mostly, she just felt a profound sense of pity for the woman who had needed to diminish others to feel large. One rainy afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed to her in Alani's perfect, slanting script. Anaya let it sit on the hall table for a day before finally opening it. It was 12 pages long, a rambling, desperate mix of accusations, self-pity, and, finally, a raw, broken apology. It spoke of a lifetime of jealousy, of being pressured by their parents to be perfect while Anaya was allowed to be herself. It was the pathetic, ugly truth behind years of cruelty. She read it, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness was a complex thing, a landscape she wasn't ready to navigate yet. Perhaps one day. But her future was here, in this sunlit apartment, with this man who saw her gold when she only saw dust. Jae-hwan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He looked out at the sprawling city below them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Anaya leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her spine. "I was thinking," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that this is a beautiful view." He tightened his arms around her, his lips brushing her temple. "It is," he agreed. "But my favorite view is right here," she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. The frayed, gray cotton thread she'd once believed herself to be had been a lie. He had been right. She was gold, and she was finally home. We hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more romantic tales.